Welcome everybody to this conversation with Peter Hayward, a futurist from Australia. He's a colleague of mine on the board of the Association of Professional Futurists. And Peter is cherished and important to me because he and his colleagues started the Future Pod podcast, which for those of you who are interested in foresight, I see we have a lot of campers, futurist camp alum on the call today. Peter and his team have done a remarkable service for those of us interested in foresight, which is that FuturePod is really dedicated to interviewing what I would consider sort of the second generation futurists or the 1.5 generation futurists who have laid the groundwork for the foresight tools that we really use today. And since the COVID epidemic breakout, Peter has done another great service, which is that he's gone back to some of the futurists that he interviewed in the first and second seasons of FuturePod. And he has asked them a series of questions about COVID and about this disruption, and if this is era change, if it's not era change. And as I've been putting together kind of my series of thoughts about how can we be better than before? How can we make sure that we don't just snap back to what normal was, which is people's, that's the reflex, that's the instinct, is to go back to what was known. But can we use this as a moment to recognize that what was known, the old way as of January, was actually kind of busted. It was kind of broken. It wasn't necessarily a future that everybody would want, or a future in which more people can thrive. So it's a pleasure to welcome Peter Hayward, it's 8 o'clock his time there in Australia, cocktail hour, getting close to the end of the day here in the US, where most of our folks are coming from. Peter, a huge, deep bow of gratitude. I've been texting your bio to folks if they haven't already checked you out. Thank you for agreeing to join us. It's really a privilege to have you with us.
It's a delight. I love talking to folks like you, and I love talking about this vocation about building better futures for everybody.
Yeah, and so folks know, you started in the taxation office. So
Yep.
That's near and dear to many of our hearts who work in local government in and around
Yep.
the public space. And without
Yep.
even knowing it, your boss kind of shaped how you think in a very systemic, futuristic
Yeah.
way. Then you went and practiced really in a big way, studied foresight with one of the first programs there in Australia. And then you took that program over and ran it for 12 years. So it feels like you've covered so many of the bases. And so we've got a rich trough from which to dip today. I wanted to start, Peter, by asking you this question. For those of you who listen to FuturePod, you know that Peter always starts with this question, and I can't wait to turn the tables on you. The question, Peter, is, we're moving from what to what? We're moving from what to what? What do you say?
Well, we're moving from the weird to the weirder. And I use weird to describe even the present, because if someone said to you, gee, things are weird, then you're not inclined to simply expect that someone's got an answer for weird. I mean, weird requires you to observe it, to sort of not necessarily try to understand it because it's weird, and just kind of go with it and learn from it, and maybe take what seems to come up. And so, because the thing before, as you call it, the old normal, which wasn't particularly normal, I've got to tell you. I'm an economist by training. There wasn't much we were doing economically that made sense in the previous world. And yet we continue to do more things that didn't seem to make sense. And we had property bubbles, and we had zero interest rates. And at the same time, we had crazy weather. And so that's why I kind of fixed on this word of weird, that, things are weird and getting weirder. And it, to me, gives you a chance to understand that all you can do in the face of weird is just go, wow. And then work out what you're going to do, rather than say, who's to blame? Who's caused weird? I mean, there's no one behind this. There's no master plan. It's just weird and getting weirder. And people are trying to do their best and it's getting madder. And I just think COVID's just pushing us to another level of weird. I don't mind weird. I think weird's got potential because weird could be, you can nudge it. That's kind of my very wordy answer to your very simple question.
From weird to weirder though, I mean, I think it's an excellent response because it is difficult to, you cannot pin this down. I remember you saying at one point that, when you were working in the taxation office, you identified as a problem solver, that you've always been a problem solver. And one of the big pivots you made was to realize that not every problem can be solved.
No.
So for people who right now are like feeling like they have to come up with some answers, they have to make sense of things. I think about a client I just was talking to, and they are trying to decide when they are going to reopen City Hall. They need to formulate some answers.
Yeah.
What's your arm around the shoulder to them, Peter?
I think always useful is to think of what looks better. So there's this notion of trying to make things better than they are. One of the things I say about problems, particularly to people like me and like I'm going to guess a lot of the people here, is we want to solve problems. And I'm going, good, we should come up with a solution. We should come up with a fix. But what is critical is to understand where you want to be on the other side of the fix. In other words, where are you trying to go in the longer term? What is the orientating position you're taking? In other words, when you have wicked problems, and we all know what wicked problems are, they're things that we face that we don't think we have any good choices. we have the option of doing this that I don't like and the option of doing that I don't particularly like either. But we have to choose something. So my say is, well, on the end of this, when this problem has been addressed, whatever we do, are we closer to where we want to be in the future, or have we moved ourselves further away? And that's why problems occupy us now, and they should, because that's where we've got to fix them. Mm-hmm. But we cannot lose sight of where we want to be. What Hardin Tibb called, the orientating star. I remember I worked with a group of people in Australia. They ran a very, very large food organisation, but they came from a faith background. And one of the few, large organisations that come, from faith. The actual founder founded the actual food thing on the ability to give food to people who had disadvantage. And I was there to do a futures workshop with the board. But the guy said, would you mind before we start, we'd like to do a testimonial. And I said, yeah, sure. And so he read the founder's letter out. The founder's letter was 100-year letter as to what the organisation was being created for. And he read the letter out. It's a short letter. And then he went around every member of the board and said, are we true to the founder's letter or are we off course?
Wow, that had to be so powerful.
Exactly. And people went around saying, yes, I think we are. No, I think we're off. That kind of, there are actually people talking about we could be successful and fail. We could, all this. And this was before they started talking about the future. And so what I said to them was, future cannot knock you off course because you know where you want to be. Yeah. All you will ever do is respond in the moment. But you'll respond in the moment with an idea of where you want to be. So my arm around people who are trying to fix problems is to say, do you know where you want to be after this? And choose the solution that puts you closer to where you want to be or in a better position. Because there's nothing worse than solving a problem and therefore creating a bigger problem.
Right, exactly. It reminds me, just today, I was talking with a woman I really respect. She runs a very large chamber of commerce. And she's a futurist. She doesn't bill herself as one, but she is one. And we were talking about going back to the core question of why this organization exists. Because if you looked at the normal schedule of events, you would think that they existed to have meetings. That's what you would think. But that's not the actual reason that they exist. And so to go back to that guiding star, that North Star for cities, you know, are we about efficiency or are we about equality, right? Those are the two sort of big economic questions that we ask with the economy. So can we shift gears just a little bit? You've been having these really rich conversations with futurists in this time of coronavirus, in this time of COVID. And, you know, I don't want to come off as too much of a fangirl, but y'all, these podcasts are worth listening to. You will hear echoes in my own questions of the other futurists who we're having on these webinars. But I wonder what has really stopped you in your tracks in some of these interviews with your colleagues that has just been so insightful.
Yeah. I mean, we've got 4 of the COVIDs out there, another 3 coming. One of my colleagues, who's the person who does the loading up of our website, she has had her job blow up in a spectacular way. And so we've had a slight hold up in getting them out. So there's more to come. So there's about 7 or 8 that are in the series. I suppose there have been many things, Rebecca, that have kind of caused me to think, wow, I'm going to talk about one because I actually think it's a really, really important one. And it's one that sits with me. Is one of the things, and again, apologies if I'm teaching a bit, but to some extent I'm kind of doing this for the audience. One of the things that is core to what Rebecca and I do is this understanding of paradox. Because the future is paradoxical. Often there are things we can do that seem to be good and bad. If we do more of it, it's good, but it's also bad. It's also both. Things are good or bad. And the thing that came up was this notion of social isolation. I can't remember which guest it was, but they talked about the fact that we were becoming a very isolated society that has now had an incentive to become even, in other words, to make ourselves safe, we need to get away from people. And at one level, the answer is, yes, of course, that makes perfect sense. And at another level, it makes no sense because, and we're seeing that people, while we might have been drifting apart into our own little worlds, the remarkable pushback, the other side of it, is how people are so creative in trying to find ways to be connected when they have to be isolated. I'm having my first family conversation via Zoom this weekend, and my family's spread all around Australia, and my family wouldn't meet very often. It's the simple nature of when families get spread, you generally only get together either at a funeral or a kind of wedding kind of thing. They're the only occasion. But people are taking moments out to try and find ways to reconnect, and it's an interesting kind of, as I say, paradox between how we have to be separate in order to be safe, but if we're separate, we're not safe. We actually need to have connection. And the reason I bring it up was, and again, I'm sure some of your guests will know this, what was an emerging issue last year was the science of the impact of loneliness as a public health issue was just starting to emerge. They were starting to say loneliness is not just a problem for a person. It's actually a public and social concern because of its connection with other problems. And so we have this world where, in the last weird world, loneliness was starting to become, it was only very early in the conversation. It was starting to get up in the policy level, Then we had COVID that's kind of said, get by yourself as fast as you can, and coming together means you get arrested and you get fined and everything else. A really weird set of behaviours where the police are walking around to someone saying, why are you walking that dog? Stop holding hands. And then you've got everything from the kids on spring break or running down to Florida and getting on the beach. The same thing in Australia. They had to close Bondi Beach in Sydney. I mean, really weird stuff. And at the same time, we've got people having parties, weddings, funerals, as I said, that for me has been one of the most, powerful things of just coming around to how at this time when we need to be separate, we need to be together.
Yeah.
And how, as a broader society, we need to find better ways to be connected. And maybe this is one of those moments that, human creativity is going to push us to some things. I'm thinking of older people that are isolated, that were very isolated before this. Are there going to be ways that they can be less isolated after this through the things people have learned? That's the kind of, that's that.
Yeah. One of the things, I can't remember which guest said it, but he was talking about being really careful about language in this moment. And I have to say that really struck me, and it probably because of availability bias, that, the day before, I think I had seen that a governor assigned like the head of a military to like run the public health operation. And I don't know that that's necessarily good or bad, but certainly when you put a commander in charge of something, it gives you a certain mindset about things. I wonder what you think the right metaphor is for this from weird to weirder time. Are we dancing? Are we tangoing? Are we doing jujitsu, as Peter Bishop said? What are we doing?
I don't think it's a one size fits all, obviously, and you wouldn't be suggesting that. I think you need to find, it's really, language, there's a New Zealand Prime Minister called Jacinta Ardern. I'm sure you've heard of her. She's a remarkable woman, and she's been doing, they closed New Zealand down very quickly, very, very hard. Very hard. And I read a piece written on her, and what the person said was she was very good at direction setting and meaning making. And for them, that's the essence of what leadership is in times of crisis. And so I tend to not say this is a good or bad. I fully understand how when you choose a metaphor, you therefore choose a range of solutions to the situation. So I understand how language is critical. But I come to this notion of how do you both unify and marshal people's best energies and give them purpose and direction. And from that sort of suite of things, there I think you choose your metaphor. And so the notion of struggle, we have a rich cultural history of stories of heroes and heroic acts. And we only build statues to heroes. We don't build statues to people who prevent. So there are no statues to good, foresightful people.
That's right. Therefore, you and I will never be memorialized.
No, we will never be memorialized. And that's and we kind of accept it. But let's not also, that doesn't mean that heroic acts should not be talked about. And we've seen people, we've seen populations come out and applaud the workers. So to me, again, I think we choose our language carefully. It's like how I say, what's the future you want beyond this? Choose the way of framing this that works best for your community and their situation, what will best bring forward the best energies of people. And this thing of both meaning making and direction setting, because these are what the business is about. Because and as I said, to me, I can understand a military metaphor. I can understand, for example, the British. If you look at the British, and they have a rich history, particularly through World War II, of and it's a powerful, powerful way to unify people and unify culture. And I'm going to go, go for it. If that's the one that works for you, go for it.
I'm hearing you say that it's very contextual. It's contextual based on what you know about stirring the best in people. So I'm going to, first of all, just a quick timeout for everyone on the call today. We've got 86 people on the call. I think our youngest person might be 11 years old. Our next generation futurist, Owen, I'm not sure if he's on with his mom, who's a futurist camp alum. She's like, Owen listened in on the last one. Can he come to the next one? I said, absolutely. So shout out to Owen if you're here. But I want to point out that there's a chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. And that is a great place for you to throw a question my direction. I'll be asking Peter to respond to some of these interspersed with my questions. And I do have a question for you. This is, as you know, I do a fair amount of work in the public sector and the public adjacent sector. And the question is about where municipal governments end up after this. And I realize that might be a difficult, Australia is certainly a different system than the United States. But I think we have many of the same constraints. and similar federal leadership right now. So I wonder what you think. You know, where do you think municipal government will be on the other side of this?
I'll tell half a story just, and then I'll come to your answer, which is, I mean, when I was actually studying, when I kind of went to formally study futures, I've been working as a futurist without actually knowing I'd been a futurist. And then I got a chance to study in the Master of Foresight at Swinburne with Richard Slaughter. And the year was 2001. And a certain event in September, if you remember, the 11th of September, which of course was the 12th of September for us. Now, the world for foresight and the work that I got changed dramatically on that day. And it almost became, in the minds of a lot of decision makers, again, the weird got weirder. And foresight suddenly was of interest to people. I think because people both needed to, could you give me certainty? Can you give me control? Can you give me understanding? So what opened up with September 11 and then the GFC after that was people prepared to listen to you. Now, if I come back to now, on the far side of what you would call Horizon 1, when the emergency has been somewhat stabilised, and we might talk about what stable looks like. If you are in the prevention space in local government, and so much of local government works in prevention and preparation, and you might have found it really, really hard to get listened to before because others kind of crowded you out. What I'm going to say to you is this will be your time to shine. You will have it'll be the easiest thing for you to basically sit in front of, a group of decision makers and say, were we ready? Were we as ready as we needed to be? Were we living, and really play your card, because this is your race in the hole. And if we had not prepared for this, if we had not done the preparation, the prevention, the resilience work, then the answer is going to be, well, we are going to do it now, aren't we?
Right.
And so, as I say, and so much of, and it doesn't need to, and it doesn't need to be in the narrow space of health. I take this to the broader scheme of preparation and building resilience and building capacity. So anything, if you're in a capacity building, resilience building, obviously in the health space.
So that would be one of your predictions.
You'll have a window about 2 or 3 years for you to get in there and really get on the front foot, because this is your chance. This is your chance.
This is your chance from a municipal government perspective. And resiliency has been a word that many municipal governments, especially those on the coast who are being wildly impacted by climate, as Australia has been. I wonder, in Australia, I've got a question for me, and then I've got a question from a guest. When you think about these sort of twin, we talked about the bushfires before most of the folks got on, and how 15 million square kilometers have been burned in Australia. And now you've got this pandemic. How does that shape the psyche of a people, of a nation?
Again, a big question for a person sitting in the suburbs of Melbourne to answer. I mean, again, fires in Australia are an old story. I mean, they're an old white man's story, but they go back to, of course, the first Australians who've been here, I remind you, for 70,000 years. The Aboriginal community in Australia is still the longest living continuous civilization on the planet. And they have lived with fire and used fire all their time, and they have shaped the physical environment. One of the things, as I say, the First Nations of Australia have a relationship with fire, and what's starting to creep into the vernacular here in Australia is this notion of living with something, which is a very different language change from the notion of dominating something. I'll tell another half story and I'll come back to it. I worked with a person who was in the, I've forgotten, I think he was a hydrological engineer. Basically, he was a person who who specialised in water. And he had worked heavily in the Netherlands. And as you know, the Netherlands have built this incredible series of dikes and retentions to recover land from the sea. Mm-hmm. And that had been a core part of their metaphor as a society for over 150 years. They were now changing the story from defending from the ocean to living with water. And of course, this was controversial because it meant you let water come in, you let water leave, you moved people to where they were safe if the water emerged. And so, I mean, in Australia, back to your question, Australia has we have a pioneer culture. We're a very young country like yours. The notion of the outback for us, for you, the Wild West. We have the myth and archetype of the person who goes out and trailblazes. That's not going away. But what's emerging is a softer, more embrace about living with, respect for. It's a conflict as well because some people prefer certain stories. And so to me, Australia is going to tell a new narrative about the bush. I mean, for example, our bushfires happen at Christmas time. So we have a different situation. We have our holidays at Christmas and we holiday in the bush, and the bush is the one place you can't be in summer. And so Australians are starting to have to try and actually reimagine how they holiday. And this is really important stuff. But this is also long stuff. You don't change cultural language overnight. You do it slowly, you do it deliberately, you do it gently, and you let the stories sort of retell themselves. And so Australia has a lot of retelling to do, a lot of new stories to talk about its future, because all stories take you towards a future.
Yeah, and that's right.
And this is Sahel's work with this whole notion of the metaphor and the myth. And again, back to a simple little tool that Sahel introduced us to, which is called the futurist triangle. And I encourage people to use it all the time. It's the way you tell the story of where you're going. You tell the story of the past, you tell the story of what you're leaving and what you're carrying, and then you talk about the present, and then you talk about the future. And it's about your ability to build a story about the future you're trying to create by using past, using present, using future. Because back to that point of meaning making and direction setting.
Yeah. I'm just giving everybody, just so you know, as Peter is mentioning things, I'm finding these resources and I'm throwing them in the chat. Somebody said to me the other day, they were like, Rebecca, these webinars are like an awesome podcast, but where you also get resources delivered right to you. So how many ways can we magic this up? I've got a question that was sent to me privately. I think it harkens back to what we were talking about a moment ago, but the question is, what creates the tendency to intervene rather than to prevent? There are so many examples of not wanting to spend money upfront versus reacting after the fact and then spending so much more.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's a human nature response that when we see something not being used, we think of it as waste resource or available resource. And really, I mean, the essence of natural resilience is having spare capacity in the system such that the shock doesn't blow the system up. The system has an ability to bounce around. And if you look at nature, and I'm a gardener and I'm a keen food grower in my own backyard, at one level the nature is not very efficient, meaning it never completely exhausts the supply of something. And so, you could imagine bringing in an efficiency person saying, we can actually make plants that get more water out of the, or get
dam engineers. I mean, that's what's going through my mind right now. Yes.
But of course, the beauty of leaving reserve is it does a couple of things. Reserves mean there's something there in case things get tough. And reserve also allows another thing to come in and utilise it. So this is the notion of the ecosystem. and this notion that there is not one thing here but many things here, and we leave. So it's a hard sell when people haven't got resourced to look at all those face masks in the cupboard and say, well, what are they there for? And the answer is well, if we get a major pandemic and we need face masks and protective security, and the person goes, yeah, but we haven't had one for 99 years. The Spanish flu was in 1918. I mean, you could imagine a hospital administrator fighting to say,
yes,
I think we need to have more in the cupboard. And the person going, it's been and yet, and then hindsight's always right. This is why we're not doing, we're not, we teach foresight, not hindsight. You don't need, I didn't teach a master of hindsight because everyone's got perfect hindsight.
Right, right.
So look, it is a tough sell. There's no question. And if things are, I mean, one of the great cultural things that communities had to learn was don't eat your seed. I mean, think of it. I mean, you're in a village, it's tough, it's winter, and you've got this seed corn for next year. And the answer is we need food now. And the answer is you can't eat the seed.
Right.
So again, an old story, but it makes the point. So the notion of don't eat your seed, otherwise you haven't got anything on the other side of this. And so to me, that's why people, because we run lean and we have a preference for efficient rather than the other kind of thing, there is tremendous pressure to say that things that are available should be utilised.
Yeah.
And you just got to try and hold the line. You've got to try and find a way to frame the story that the person will go, you're right. Whether it's, the time we need a fire brigade and start planning a fire brigade isn't when the fire's coming over the hill.
That's right. Well, it's, I've been saying it again and again. It's like insurance, right? Insurance is a little something you tuck away so that when you need that margin, when you have that emergency, it's there.
And you hope not to need it. You hope
exactly,
not to need it.
Exactly. Success is not having to use it, right?
Exactly.
We've got another question. Here it is. Those of you who are playing along, you can see that Michelle sent this to everybody. The question is this: we're in the midst of a city council election in May, and it will probably need to be moved to November. How do you avoid the human reaction to just wait for the next city council to decide what we are on the other side of this?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, how do you avoid? Well, I mean, understand there is an option that says you can wait. It's always an option. And as I teach decision making, and this will sound heretical, but Rebecca knows me, I'm a heretic. Prevarication is a strategy. And often the wisest thing for you to do is to say nothing and let things just roll out. In other words, so I'm not saying in every case for you to be brave and get out in front and be the brave person. And it might be that if you think this isn't the time, then let them do it. But if you said, what would it look like if we wanted to get on the front foot? Well, the answer would be then tell me a future beyond the election that you think is a good future for your council. And if people say, yeah, I like that future, now backcast from that future as to how you resolve the election. This is don't solve a problem in the present. Tell the story of the way we solved this problem helped us create this future. Mm-hmm. So don't make problems part of pathways.
That's right. So, and that all just goes back to like, where are we going with this? How does this all add up? What do we want on the other side of this? I'm deep in my own sense making, when things get weird, I hook up arms with other people and we talk about the signals that we're noticing. Absolutely. And we try to make sense together. So every Monday, Wednesday, Friday for half an hour, I have a group of, weirdos like us get together and we just talk about what are you hearing and how are you making sense of this? And one of my homies is an economist, brilliant guy, taught at the Air Force Academy for years, is a co-founder of a successful startup. And he said, I'll edit for rated PG-13. He said, and for Owen possibly, holy crap, he said, the way we teach economics is just totally messed up. You know, we teach and teach and teach for efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. We say like, oh, the equity stuff can come later, but the systems are so broken. You know, when now the news is coming out in the US about how Black and brown people are dying at much higher rates of COVID. And that is not about a public health issue. That is about a structural issue that has favored efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. So, you know, when you think about where is it that we want to be, that it just harkens back to this conversation last night. We have another private message from somebody, Terry Grimm's colleague at the Foresight Alliance says hello.
Hi, Terry.
Well, it's her colleague actually. So she says, it's clear we need a post-consumer capitalism economy, but on the other hand, there's currently almost no public conversation to speak of among policymakers about the next economy. While it's understandable, it also seems clear that there could be a lot of unnecessary suffering due to this lack of consideration. Any thoughts?
Well, again, as people have had things taken away from them in the short term, and in our consumer societies, and I agree completely with Terry, that I mean, we've had taken away from us shopping, which for many people seems to be a kind of, you know, a raison d'etre, a reason for, you know, what they do. I'm serious. We've also had taken away from us sport, which there's the physical act of sport, but there's also this incredible industry around the consumption of sport. The other thing that's been withdrawn from us is tourism, which is another huge economy and a huge source of consumption where people travel to have experience. So all these things, and they're deeply sensory. This is my point, is that shopping, the consumption of sport, and the consumption of tourism are sensory exercises. We're doing it, there's a physical dimension, but there's also a sensory dimension. Now, when people are denied that sensory aspect of their life, then you're going to start seeing breakouts of creativity when people try to get substitute experiences. Now, Terry's question, which I think is a fair question, is when people go back to normal, if we go back to normal, will they then rush back to the stores, rush back to sitting on the couch consuming ESPN, and rush back to the cruise, you know, sort of, you know, the cruise liners chugging around the world? Or will some people go, yeah, I actually found some really cool ways to do it this way, that way. So to me, there are tremendous vested interests that want us to go back to the shopping malls and the holiday destinations. Yes. So there are tremendous commercial interests to do that. And there are also going to be people's experiences of what they had during the lockdowns.
That is, you know, you've been talking about nudging the conversation, and it's interesting because the creativity piece, I feel like, is both a nudge to helping people understand that we can make meaning in other ways that aren't necessarily consumer oriented. And also, I will say, for all my men out there, I know that 40 to 80% of your day prior to this was spent reading the sports pages, listening to sports radio, and kibitzing about this.
But again, one of the things that is starting to emerge is e-sport.
Yep.
That the Formula One drivers are racing one another. I saw the basketballers were playing. Now, again, I'm not at all suggesting that we're going to see everyone stop going to watch sport. But the point is, some people are going to go, yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, it's going to become more fragmented and less monolithic post this. Now, the other thing, which again, back to Terry's point, is that you would have heard people banging on quite a lot about the level of carbon emission and the carbon intensity of our society. Now, what this is giving us by shutting down effectively tourism, air travel, everything else, we're seeing what a low carbon intensity economy looks like. Now, we may not like it, but we're getting in on, but we're running an experiment and we're in the experiment.
That's right.
Rather than this abstract notion of, oh, a low carbon economy would mean us all running around, living, like cavemen, sort of, banging people on the heads, a zombie. No, a low carbon economy isn't dystopian. It's a low carbon economy.
Right. This is such a great setup for Mark Shannon's question. Good to see you, Mark. You think about how many processes, he said, stood in the way of change until COVID made the impossible possible. Yeah. What is your sense, or what experience do you have? Like, how long does this window of possibility stay open?
How long? Again, I mean, a word of caution here to Mark and everyone else is that in September 11 and the last GFC, a lot of people were writing op-ed pieces saying everything's changed. And the answer would be, when you look back, is that no, actually very little changed. So for me, it's look for change on the margin, because the instrumental powers that want the normal to come back are not going to go away. So there are tremendous pressures to return. And they are going to do everything they can to get people to go back, which means advertising, incentives, the economy, the government to understand they're not bad. They're simply saying, we understand that world. It mightn't work, but we understood it. It's the joke about the drunk who the policeman found the drunk on his hands and knees under a street light. And the copper said, what are you doing? He said, I dropped my house key. And he said, where'd you drop it? At my front door. He said, why are you here? He said, because the light's better. In other words, people actually want to go back to a past that didn't work, but they understood it. Yeah. Rather than this emerging future. So back to my point is, there is going to be, and significant parts of the world are going to go back to almost be exactly the same. That doesn't mean we failed. Is what's happened on the periphery that's exciting and interesting and going somewhere, and how do you give energy and support and profile to those things? Because the creativity is always there. And the longer this stays on, the more creativity, and the longer people have from remembering what they wanted about it, is that people can then have this negotiation. Is it, what do you really want? Do you want, and so, but as I say, for many people, they just want the past to come back. Right. And it's going to happen because there's going to be a lot of resource. I mean, all the sporting codes. I mean, you've been looking at the articles about how they're going to go and move all the baseball to Arizona and play the whole season, or the NBA is going to move to Las Vegas. And as I say, they have tremendous economic power and political power that says we're going to bring the past back as quickly as we can. Right. People are going to go, yeah, okay, I'm with you, and others are going to go, maybe I'm not. And it's the most fertile places in ecosystems are on the edges. That's right. So look for where you're on the edge of things. Look at the street. Look at what's happening at the. Because in there is the interesting stuff, and then how do you leverage that stuff?
And that goes right to futures, right? Because you're always looking for those signals, right? Those, where are the patents filed? Where are the lights of opportunity blinking on and coming to full light? This might be a good segue to Susan's question. Do we think now is the right time to try to help more people make the connection between climate change and pandemics, or to the right time to educate just about interrelated systems?
It's a good question, Susan. I mean, I think once again, we have to go very slowly at these things. I think we have to settle. People have to feel safe before they can even have any conversation about the future. So we can't be impatient to move people quicker to the future we want. We have to look at what do they need. So always start where people are. And people have to feel a measure of security before you can then ask the question, what do you want? Obviously, there is a connection between a climate with more energy, with more human contact, we are going to be more and more exposed to things like this. There is an obvious scientific connection, but as I said early on in the process, we have this funny, paradoxical political response that almost all politicians around the world, apart from a few, odd people like the guy in Brazil and the guy in Turkey, who recognise the connection between science and disease. But those same people, I'm going to say, refuse to recognise the connection between science and climate.
Yeah.
Now, that's a paradox. Just highlighting the paradox and showing it to someone is, I think, useful in itself.
Yeah.
Not to make the person sound like a goose, not to pin the person down, not to win arguments. You don't win arguments in this situation. We do not use the future to win a fight.
Right.
What we try to do is influence thinking. We try to say to people, do your choices make sense as to where you want to go? Have you thought about what the future you're moving towards would look like?
Mm-hmm.
The ability to have, again, as Wendell Bell said, the ability to have consequential thinking. In other words, to teach people to think about the consequences of their action. No one's deliberately doing anything wrong to the world. I mean, there is no myth of evil people out there. No, they're all trying to do what they think is best. But to ask the question, if you continue your best, where do we end up? And is that really where you want to be?
Right. I want to toggle over so I want to just, first of all, I want to nod to all the people who've sent great questions along, but I have one more that I need to interject here that is a Rebecca Ryan question. And that is, Peter, you've spoken very eloquently about how one of the reasons the future can be such a safe place for people to enter a conversation is because no one knows it. You've said it's difficult for people in organizations or communities to talk about the past or the present because they get into pissing matches with each other about who, what the story really is and who's responsible and whatnot. And the future is a domain that nobody outright owns, and therefore often other voices can come into the conversation. And a couple of weeks ago, when this pandemic started to go big time in the US, and I just felt into that people were going to lose their minds and we were going to need to help them think beyond the apex. This is when this webinar series started and so forth. And the most downloaded webinar has been the Scenario Planning for Anxious Times webinar. Joel and Brandy and some of the other folks at the Alliance for Innovation, we did one for your folks. It was very well attended. And you have said that the reason scenarios are so helpful is because it's the way for people to have a conversation about the future. And
as multiple. This is the thing. We talk about the conversation to have in uncertainty is not what will the future be, but what could the future be?
Yeah.
And what could the futures be? You're going to get one of the COVID podcasts that are coming up that's basically, hung up with my mate, is one I did with Paul Higgins, he's a local futurist in Melbourne, but he actually he's a vet by training, and he actually worked with infectious diseases in animals. And so very quickly, Paul, on his website, and I'll give Rebecca the link and she can post it, is Paul made a set of public scenarios available about what Horizon 2 in terms of, the kind of three horizon could look like post the lockdown. And they're very simple scenarios. And Paul is made them publicly available and simply says, and he updates them according to what he's seeing. But for Paul, and Paul's got a podcast on the Future Pod series, but you'll hear Paul's COVID podcast. And what Paul tries to teach business people is to think of the future as multiple. Meaning, okay, what's your strategy? Because you've got to have one. But then the question would be, how many futures does this strategy work in? Now, there's an infinite number of futures, but if we've at least got 3 or 4 possible futures that could happen, does our strategy work in a couple of them? If it only works in one, doesn't sound really good. And that's why scenarios are powerful. Yes, they help people, but they give you the ability to stop thinking about, the future is not a bullseye.
Right. It's multiple plausible futures.
Got to be.
Yeah.
Got to be.
Mike is my buddy in North Carolina. He's working in a community, public health crisis, as so many are. He asks, you know, they provide a lot of human services at the county level. So our team members have opportunities to interact frequently with some of the most vulnerable in the community and some of the most impacted by COVID. Could you suggest a few futurist concepts that our social workers, health workers, et cetera, could integrate into their work with clients to build their clients' resiliency?
Yep. Well, again, I mean, resilience comes from two things, which is, again, if you listen to Rowena Morrow's podcast, we talked about the future of hope. Now, so Mike, hope requires two things in people, and people have them to differing degrees. One is agency, and the other is pathways. So agency is how people have self-belief, or groups have self-belief. And the way you build agency in people is you tell stories about how we have got through things previously. So however bad this is, let them tell their story of how people before them or they themselves responded to previous challenges. You know, because the simple answer is every time we respond to a challenge and we survive it, we've convinced ourselves we can survive anything. And if I'm here now, I must have survived the previous challenges I had. So any conversation about other challenges that groups have responded to is a good way to build agency. And that's 50% of giving people the sense that we can get through this. The other half, of course, is pathways. What ideas have we got? Do we have ideas of what could work? And so then you have the conversation, which is not the agency conversation, but the pathways conversation. What ideas, what's worked in the past, and so the ability for people to have agency and pathways is the essence of what builds resilience in the face of change. So that's my simple answer to Mike, is just give people basic tools. You know, when you're sitting with people who feel they can't do anything, listen carefully as to what they're telling you. Does it sound like they're lacking agency, self-belief? Then let them tell you the story of how, no, you've had agency. You did it when we responded to that hurricane or whatever. Let people remember their agency, rediscover their agency. People will do it naturally, and then move them from that into pathways.
Okay, we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. Here's one. What do you think is the evolution of globalization? This kind of global economic interdependency. I don't know. I don't think the genie goes back in the bottle.
No. I mean, globalization is an old idea. I mean, any student of history will tell you that globalization has been a phenomenon for thousands of years. I mean, civilizations have risen and fallen. A not well-known historical fact, if you heard of the Mongol Empire got taken down by the Black Plague. So globalization and things like pandemics have gone hand in hand. It makes sense. If you're global, you don't just move goods around, you move goods and disease around. And Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs and Steel, I think it's a terrific book and history of how this has kind of played out. Have a read of that. It's a good story. I mean, globalization is not going anywhere, in the sense that, you know, we are going to continue to want to have connection with people, and we want connection for people. I mean, globalization, one of the things I feel that has meant, you know, as we travel more, as we integrate our economies more, we fight less. It makes sense. You know, you're not going to declare war on someone who supplies all your wine, for example. So, but it's about, I think the questions that are being raised in globalization is not we should stop it or it's going to stop, because no, it's not going to stop. It's the nature of it and the dependencies on it. I think one of the things you're going to see now is that we're going to have a debate about, do we have supply chains for critical things like drugs that actually extend offshore? And the answer is we're going to come back going, maybe not a good idea. So I think we're going to renegotiate within the realms of a process. But yeah, I mean, we are one people on one planet. Globalization is not going to disappear. But, you know, there is going to be reshoring and returning industry, which is not a bad thing given the employment situation. But globalization is going to continue because we're a global people now, and that's the other part of the genie that's not going to go away, Rebecca, is that, yeah, we may well, to me, it's going to change. And it's about the nature of change. I reckon probably 85-90% of it goes back to how it was. That's not the point.
Yeah.
What's the different stuff?
Yeah. All right. I'm going to put this last question out there, and I'm going to invite our folks to put one word or one idea in the chat that you're walking away from after this conversation with the legendary Peter Hayward. The question, while everybody's firing up their chat, is this. So we just talked about globalization. Now we're going to swing to just hyper-localization. And the question from one of our participants was, what about like the sharing economy, like Airbnb and shared cars? And like, is this going to take a hit?
Yeah. I think sharing economy is a number of things. I think, again, this fits into this notion of what I said about individualism versus connection. I mean, the sharing economy, which is truly localized, it's had a hit, but I suspect that given a chance, people have actually made more connection with their neighbours than probably they have for a while. So there's the physical local community that I think does get an advantage. And so, in Australia, and I'm sure in America, you're seeing, people increasingly wanting to source things locally. Mm-hmm. The virtual stuff like Airbnb and other things, because they have been seen as being more global than local, where people are sharing, but who are you? People, the Airbnb is going to get a real hit, but both, Stripe and Airbnb, where people are going to simply say, I don't know who you are. You're going to have to prove who you are again. You're going to have to prove that you, in fact, are a local. One of the interesting things on the other side of lockdown is people's ability to prove that they're safe.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it's going to be interesting how that happens, because, if you get, let's say your 95-year-old, grandmother needs to have an electrician come and do some work in their house. Are you going to be saying, hang on, is it safe to put this electrician in the house that my grandmother lives in? You're going to possibly ask questions about, have you had the virus? Have you had as I say, there's going to be a whole set of negotiations now around safety and who we can trust. Now, trust is a very scary word, because trust could turn into a form of surveillance, and that's a possible future. We might see much more surveillance. We might all have to carry a mobile phone app that says, we may have to have a medical record.
Show your little passport to say I have the antibody.
It's possible, and that's a possible future. So we need to put it on there as a possible and say, how do we feel about it? If the answer is I don't like it, okay, what are we going to do about stopping it? Because there are people like, the electronic EFF, what are they called? The
Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm a sponsor and I've forgotten their name. But they're actually fighting this fight now. So again, there are people out there fighting your fight. If you know the possible futures and there are futures that you want, then give people love, give them support, give them money.
Yeah.
And because this is how you get to the future. You can't do it all. There's too many futures, but find the people who are fighting for the futures that you want, support them.
So you have been a generous guest. Consider this us applauding you out. Here's the chat just lit up when I asked, what are you taking away from this? Resilience. Where do you want to be on the other side? Globalization and people wanting to connect. This talk could help form a different future. The futures are multiple. Are we closer to what we want to be in the future? Agency. Which future are we walking towards? Agency and pathways. The link of permaculture and futures. Hope. Working with, not fighting against. Creativity, agency, pathways. The future is safer to talk about than the past and present. Planning and reserves. The thought that it might be easier for local governments to build resiliency, capacity, preparedness on the other side of this. More words. Opportunity. Power of deep listening. Pivot possibilities. Where do we want to be on the other side? If we want different futures, we need to think, create, and tell better stories. don't solve a problem in the present. Hope. Multiple futures. What are the strategies and what are possible futures? Making hope happen. Intentional decisions, pivot, lead people to look at futures through consequential thinking, intentionality, foresight, privacy and safety, resiliency. How do you gather people's energies and unify them in a common direction? I'm going to leave it there for now, but Peter, I hope you can feel that what you have shared with us today has landed.
Great fun. I'm all warm. I'm all warm and buzzing over here.
Good, good. Have a wonderful Friday. Make Friday great and send it our direction, okay? All right.
See ya.
See ya. Thank you, Peter. Bye, everybody. Bye.